on the YouTube channel. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Welcome, one and all, as we prepare to immerse ourselves in words of Torah, and specifically in words of Gemara, words of the Talmud. I'm delighted to be here today with all of you, and also with Cantor Amanda Kleinman. Hi, there she is. I'm going to see if I can spotlight myself alongside Cantor. Here we go. There we are. So we're both here today presenting, and the theme of our Talmud study for the year is going to be around the upcoming holidays or season and all of the meaning that we can mine from the Babylonian Talmud about the things that are really familiar to us as, you know, contemporary Jewish people, still practicing the holidays and observing the seasons that the rabbis laid out for us, you know, the better part of 2,000 years ago, deriving their wisdom in part from their own ingenuity and creativity, and also in part from what the Torah tells us about these holidays. But as we began to see last week, just because the Torah tells us something about a holiday does not necessarily mean that that is how the rabbis wanted us to observe these holidays. Cantor Kleinman, in addition to being an amazing chazan on the bima, is also an incredible student of and teacher of Jewish text and tradition, including extensive study in Gemara. I just need to share with the community, since Cantor is very humble, that her textual chops are truly extraordinary. And, you know, in the world of Jewish study, again, whether you're Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, or not affiliated, the ability to unpack a daf or a page of Gemara is kind of considered the real proving ground that separates the women from the girls, the men from the boys. So the idea is that Cantor Kleinman actually, during her cantorial studies, also applied herself in dedicated study of these texts, and brings a lot of insight, wisdom, and experience. And it's really fun for us to do a lot of things together, including teaching. So, Cantor, do you want to kick us off? And we're going to kind of do a lot of tag teaming back and forth between each other this morning. And we're also going to, of course, go through texts and invite your insights. Use the chat window, use the raise hand function. If you're actually sitting in your living room raising your hand, we may not see you doing that.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for having me to participate in your Talmud study. I've actually been jealous for a long time that this group of people gets to sit together and study Gemara every week, and I'm really excited to get to be part of this group for the month of Elul. It's always very special for me to have an opportunity to learn from Rabbi Blake, and I'm very excited for the opportunity to learn with all of you as well. As Rabbi Blake said, please interrupt, raise your hand anytime. Would love to really make this a discussion and a conversation. If you raise your hand and you don't hear me say, give me 1 second, and then I'll call on you, just unmute and feel free to interrupt me, because that probably means I didn't see you. So I understand from Rabbi Blake that you spent your last session together really sort of talking about a broad overview of the High Holy Days, and particularly some of their biblical origins, and you took a look at some Mishnaic texts as well. So this week, what we're going to do is we're going to start honing in on and focusing in on some specific elements of the High Holidays. Today, we will be focusing on the ritual of sounding the shofar. I want to preface this by saying that there is a whole lot in the Talmud about the ritual of sounding the shofar. So this will be really just an overview that offers some insights into a few things that Rabbi Blake and I found to be particularly interesting. The first text that we're going to start with today, if you have the syllabus, we're going to be on Rosh Ha-Shanah 16a. I'll pull it up on the screen as well. And Rabbi Blake, tell me if this is correct, but I believe, oops, looks like the chat is coming up on the screen. I believe that last week, you may have spent some time talking about this Mishnah that comes at the beginning of Rosh Hashanah 16a. Is that correct? I remembered you.
That's right.
Yeah, because I remembered you mentioning all of the creatures passing before God like sheep. So I know that you spent some time on this Mishnah last week. So we're not going to go into it in depth, but I would like to review it just so that we can sort of orient ourselves to where we are in the Talmud. I think it's helpful oftentimes when we can to think about sort of what comes right before whatever it is that we're going to be looking at together. The passage that we're going to look at first is a passage that starts to explore some of the spiritual significance around why we sound the shofar, why we make the particular sounds that we make. So this is a good sort of introduction to the entire ritual of sounding the shofar. So last week, you looked together at this Mishnah that tells us, and I'll read just the English for this Mishnah because I know that you looked at it in greater detail last week. At 4 times of the year, the world is judged. On Passover, judgment is passed concerning grain. On Shavuot, concerning fruits that grow on a tree. On Rosh Hashanah, all creatures pass before God like sheep. As it is stated, God who fashions their hearts alike, who considers all their deeds. And on the festival of Sukkot, people are judged concerning water. In other words, the rainfall that is to come over the year ahead. So that's where we are. You looked at this last week. And so now what the Talmud does.
Cantor, will you just enlarge the text a little bit?
Yes. Just like that?
Maybe one more click. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, of course. And so, so now what the Gemara does is it goes into each of these holidays that are described and starts to go into greater detail around the spiritual significance of some of the elements of each of those holidays. We're going to skip to the section that talks to us about Rosh Hashanah. Right before the section we're looking at, which is going to discuss the shofar, we have our first introduction to Rosh Hashanah in this section of the Gemara. And what it's referring to are 3 of the important themes of Rosh Hashanah, which is the theme of Malchuyot, of God's sovereignty or God's kingship, as sometimes we refer to, Zichronot, remembrances, and shofarot, the blasts of the shofar. Okay, and so what the Gemara is now doing is taking from the last of these 3 themes of Rosh Hashanah, the theme of shofarot, and now is going to go into a detailed unpacking of the ritual of sounding the shofar and why we do it. So we're going to start right here at section 16, and we read, Amar Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu says, Rabbi Abahu is a 3rd, 4th century Palestinian scholar. Lama tokin bishofar shel ayil. So why do we sound a shofar specifically that is made of a ram's horn? And Rabbi Blake, tell me, I think I'm correct that one of the texts that you're going to go into soon is going to unpack also the idea of using the horns of other animals. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. But this section of the text is asking, why are we sounding a shofar that's made specifically from a ram's horn? And the answer that we're given here is Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's because God says, Tik'u lefanai b'shofar shel ayil, kedei she'ezkor lachem akedat Yitzchak ben Avraham. So you should sound before me a shofar that's made of a ram's horn so that I can remember on your behalf the story of the binding of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Uma'aleh ani alechem ki'ilu akadatem atzmechem lefanai. And I can elevate you as if you had sacrificed yourselves before me. Okay, so what the text is telling us here is that the reason that we sound a ram's horn is not only as a remembrance of the story of the binding of Isaac. And we read in the end of the story of the binding of Isaac that just as Abraham is about to sacrifice his son Isaac, the angel says, stop, stop, stop. He doesn't sacrifice Isaac, but instead he sees a ram. And so he decides to sacrifice the ram in place of Isaac. And so we then use a shofar that's made of a ram's horn as not only though as a remembrance of that story, but I think the second part of this text is especially interesting. Uma'aleh ani aleichem ki ilu akadetem atzmechem lefanai. So the use of the ram's horn then elevates us as though we had sacrificed ourselves before God. We may not get into this in depth right now, but I think that there's a really interesting theological implication here, right? Which is sometimes we can read the end of the story of the binding of Isaac, and we are to learn from that, that God is not looking for that kind of sacrifice from us. But in this section of the Gemara, the sages are suggesting, in fact, that the use of a ram's horn symbolizes our own sacrifice of ourselves to God. We'll continue in just a second, but I'm just wondering if there are any questions or comments about what we've read so far, which I think is interesting. Susan, we can't hear you yet, so you still need to unmute.
I think what you said, I just wrote it down. I thought what you said was brilliant, that it applies to me, to think before you sacrifice someone, before you take action. And the sacrifice doesn't have to be when you hurt somebody physically, but when you hurt somebody spiritually or emotionally. And I thought that was just struck what I've been going through now about just, taking your time before you invest in something that may not be satisfying. So 2 thumbs up.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful. Steve.
I was just going to say that it's not that it's as if we sacrifice ourselves, it's as if we are willing to offer ourselves by binding to sacrifice ourselves. Mm-hmm. Just the willingness to serve, let's say.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that that's a very helpful clarification here. Ki'ilu akadetem atzmechem lefanai really is as if you bound yourselves before me, not necessarily that you followed through with that sacrifice. Thank you. Steve.
I think pursuing that comment, I think it's good to probe what we mean by, if you look at the Sefaria translation, if you had bound yourself, it's like giving us an opportunity once again with intentionality to intensely, deliberately try to commit to the covenant and to follow God's ways, and to recognize you need the shofar, similar to your beautiful comments on the website, to jolt you from the challenges of daily life and existence, that it really does require, with all of your physical and mental and emotional energy, to truly commit once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
No,
somebody else was about to
No, I
ask.
was just chiming in that I think that one of the powerful illustrations of, how Jewish holidays are observed comes up time and time again. On Pesach, we are explicitly taught in the Haggadah that we're reading the story not because of what happened to those people back then, but the point of storytelling in the Jewish tradition, the point of ritualizing our storytelling in this way, and kind of creating stories that are multi-sensory experiences, whether it is through the tastes and smells of the Passover Seder, or in this case, the sound of the shofar, is to immerse ourselves so that it's not that we're reading a story about Isaac, we're creating a ritual drama where we become Isaac, right? This is, if you really want to be in it, you have to appreciate that this is not just a story that the cantor is chanting from the pulpit. It's an opportunity to immerse ourselves in the identities of the characters about which we're reading.
And I would add to immerse ourselves into the human and theological, all of the human and theological challenges and complications of what it means to be willing to bind ourselves before God in that way. And so I think that these are, you know, these are beautiful and also challenging comments. Let's take
We have
2
one more. Yeah, we have an iPad. Oh, iPad is my mom and dad.
Oh, excellent.
I didn't know how to rename my box here, but it seems to me that this passage, the Yakedat, also serves as proof text for 2 powerful postulates. One is that child sacrifice is not permitted, and 2 is that animal sacrifice is very much permitted. So going forward in the way, you know, Israelite worship takes place, it's going to be very much, yes, we want animal sacrifices, not the children, but we do want animal sacrifices.
Yes. Yes, we want animal sacrifices. And we also want to make sure, though, that we, even though we know it's really going to be an animal sacrifice, that we are, you know, so dedicated that we are willing to offer ourselves in that way as well.
Yes.
Thank you. So I thought I saw one more hand, but I think it's down. So why don't we continue a little bit in this next section, and we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to talk about the significance of other pieces of the shofar ritual now. The Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, or he asks a question, Lama tokin b'Rosh Ha-Shanah? Why do we sound the shofar on Rosh Ha-Shanah? And the Talmud is going to ask the question that I think we may all be asking ourselves, Lama tokin, why do we sound the shofar? Like, why would you even ask that question, right? But we read here Rachamana, and Rachamana is a way of referring to God in the Talmud. It comes from the Hebrew root rachem, the merciful one. Rachmana Amar Tiku. So God said we should sound the shofar. And we have a proof text here that comes from the book of Psalms. I'll pull it up on the side over here. And I forgot which verse it is.
I think it's verse 4.
Verse 4. Okay.
Yeah, it'll click when you click it, it should go straight to the verse. So you just scroll back up. Yeah.
Okay. And so this is actually a pasuk. These are verses that we chant from the bima on Rosh Hashanah. So pay special attention on Erev Rosh Hashanah to hear them this year. Tik'u v'chodesh shofar b'kesa leyom chagenu. And then verse 5, Ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat lelohei Yaakov. You may remember from our Erev Rosh Hashanah services when we chant Tik'u v'chodesh shofar. Sorry, I wasn't anticipating singing, so I didn't warm up this morning. So we say Tik'u, sound the horn, the shofar, on the new moon, on the full moon for our feast day, for it is a law for Israel, a ruling of the God of Jacob. So our sages are saying here, we sound the shofar because God said so. And here's our proof text. We saw it in the verse from Psalms. But I want us to pay special attention to the verb that is used here for sounding the shofar. It says, Lama tokin, Rachmana Amar tik'u. Does that sound familiar to anybody, that word? Does that sound like one of the names of one of the shofar blasts? Tokin. Anyone can feel free to shout it out. Tekiah, exactly, right? So that's the word Lama tokin. It's the same root as tekiah. The next question that our sages are going to ask is going to be Ella, but what? However, Lama miri'in, right? Which we're going to translate in the same way. Why do we sound the shofar? And but here we're using a different verb to refer to how we're sounding the shofar. Miri'in. Does this sound like another shofar call that you're familiar with?
Consonants are all in place. It's the vowels that
Yeah.
change.
Shivari.
So this one is actually teruah, and it's confusing because the e sounds are coming through, but this is the same root as the word teruah. So we had lama tokin. Why do we make this tekiah sound? And this is lama miri'in, which technically is translated the same way, but we could say here, why are we making these teruah sounds? And the Talmud answers in the same way, miri'in. They're like, again, why are we asking this question? Rahmana Amar Zichron Teruah. God said that we should be doing this. And here's another proof text from the book of Leviticus. Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, b'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad lachodesh, yihiyeh lachem shabbaton Zichron Teruah Mikra Kodesh. Speak to the Israelite people, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, should be for you a complete rest, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. And the loud blasts here are Teruah. Okay, so we see that there are 2 words here that are associated with the sounding of the shofar. We see tokin, tekiah, and miri'in, teruah. I want us all to note, because we're going to talk about this later on today, that one of our shofar blasts is missing from this rabbinic explanation, and that is shivarim. That's not here. And that's because shivarim is not a biblical, that's, the idea of shivarim associated with the shofar, associated with Rosh Ha-Shanah, not biblical. Okay, that's rabbinic, and it's going to come to us later on. It's going to explain to us the biblical shofar blasts are tekiah and teruah. It's not going to explain it in this text. It's going to explain it in a text that we're going to go through a little bit later on, but I think it's important to note for right now so we can remember it when we get to it later. So then the rabbis are going to revise their question. They've asked, why tokin? Why are we sounding the shofar? Lama, why miri'in? Why are we sounding the shofar using this other word? And they've decided that those questions make no sense because the Torah, God has already told us in the Torah that these are things we're supposed to do. So they're going to revise the question. Ella, instead, the question is going to be, Lama tokin umiri'in kishehen yoshvin, v'tokin umiri'in kishehen omdin. So why is it that we sound the shofar with these 2 different types of blasts, both kishehen yoshvin, when people are sitting, v'tokin umiri'in kishehen omdin, and also sounding the shofar when people are standing? And what that's a reference to is, we don't see it in our shofar service here at WRT, but if you were to go to a conservative or Orthodox congregation, you would see that in addition to the 3 sets of shofar blasts that we all know and are familiar of as part of the service, there's an additional set of shofar calls that comes before the Musaf service, before the additional service during which the sounds of the shofar are traditionally heard. There's a second set of blasts that comes just before all of that happens. And so the rabbis are asking, like, well, why does that happen? And they give a really great answer. Kedei le'arbev hasatan, in order to confuse the Satan, or to confuse Satan. So I think that this is just it's just a fascinating answer. And I think it's important for context here to understand what Satan is in the Jewish tradition, because there are really 2 elements of it. Satan, on the one hand, was really known just sort of as the accuser or the adversary of the Jewish people, there to sort of point out all the things that we're doing wrong and help make sure that, God knows, where we need to be punished for things that we've done wrong. Later on, Hasatan becomes associated with the evil inclination, but there are really sort of 2 ways to understand Hasatan here. Steve, what were you gonna say?
I was just thinking about the parallel of this with the placement of the Shema in 2 places in the service, kind of to, maybe it was to confuse, I don't know which oppressor it was intended to confuse. I can't recall the timing of it, but it seems the same to me.
Yeah, the
Interesting.
whole
Yes.
idea is like the Satan figure in Jewish lore, long before red leotard, pitchfork, Christian imagery around Satan. Satan is basically a prosecuting attorney in the heavenly court. And Satan makes, and he's guised, written in the guise of an attorney, a prosecutor, the categor, and in Aramaic or biblical, post-biblical Hebrew. And Satan is always making the case to God, hey, look at these people, these human beings, and these Jews in particular. They're not as good as you think. And particularly when you consider how much of the imagery that the rabbis wrote into the Rosh Ha-Shanah and Yom Kippur descriptions is about standing in judgment before God. Remember, that was the very first Mishnah that Cantor showed us this morning, the one that we ended with last week, is that this is all about standing in judgment before the master of the universe. And in comes God's prosecuting attorney into the court and says, hang on for a second, before you write these nice people into the book of life, I'm going to show you all the ways in which they are flawed, they have sinned, they have transgressed, ashamnu, bagadnu, chatanu, right? And so this idea here, the rabbis are saying, well, we blow the shofar twice as a kind of preemptive demonstration of piety that will make the Satan's arguments fall to pieces in trying to prosecute us. It's like, no, they're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to bind themselves on the altar before God.
Right. Yes. And one example of where we see Hasatan as sort of the accuser of the Jewish people, one of probably the most well-known, the best known example is in the book of Job, right? Where God is showing up, or sorry, where Hasatan is showing up, and kind of suggesting all of these ways in which God could test whether Job is really as good as Job appears to be. So I'd love to ask any thoughts from any of you. How do you think blowing the shofar twice confuses Hasatan? There's no right or wrong answer here, and I'll tell you in a few minutes what some of the sages suggest could be some of the interpretations of this. But how would that confuse Hasatan to do it twice? All right, well, I'm happy to share with you some of the rabbinic interpretations that are interesting. So Rashi's suggestion is that when people show extra devotion to the mitzvah of sounding the shofar, Satan becomes sort of confused or thwarted in his efforts to try to accuse them, because not only are they doing it once, they're doing it twice. So there's such a weak case for their lack of devotion if they're doing it twice. Another interpretation is that sounding the shofar twice is actually gives us human beings an extra opportunity to awaken our souls and begin our efforts toward repentance. And that, again, sort of confuses or thwarts Satan's efforts to accuse us, because we've had now two opportunities for our souls to awaken. Steve, I saw a hand up, but then I saw it disappear. Oh, there it is. Please.
The significance of the second blast. The first blast could have been a mistake or catch you by surprise. By having a second blast, that it shows you it's intended, that these blasts are intended to capture our attention and to be responding to it.
Beautiful, beautiful. There's one more interesting interpretation from the Tosafot commentators, who say that perhaps Hasatan might think that this shofar blast, if he hears it twice, is actually the shofar blast that signifies the end of days, which I think is an especially interesting interpretation. Arlene.
You know, I think in general, our service has a repetitive quality about it, because it gives us a chance to rethink some of the same passages, but perhaps in a personal way, very different the second or third time we come across it. So I don't know if I want to include Satan in the whole thing.
I love that, though. I mean, if you take Satan out of the mix on that, though, I think you're absolutely right that our tradition is giving us multiple opportunities to think about the same passages in different ways, and also multiple opportunities if we read it through the first time and say like, this doesn't apply to me this year, to read it again and say, well, hold on. And so, I love that interpretation. And I think that even though that, Satan's in the mix here on this, that I think that that's still a beautiful intention for all of us to have in mind as we see passages in our high holiday liturgy, for the second or third time over the course of the holidays. So let's finish up this passage, and then I'll hand it over to Rabbi Blake with one more line that there's not that much to say about, but that I just think is an awesome play on words and sort of helps us conclude this section here. So we sound the shofar twice in order to confuse l'arbev hasatan, to confuse hasatan. But Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak says, Kol shana she'ein tok'in la bitchila. So any year where we don't do that extra set of shofar blasts at the beginning before the Musaf service, miri'in la bisofa. So you remember we saw this word miri'in as the word that sounds like trua, right? It's one of the words for sounding the shofar. But the root of that word has in common the root Resh Ayin Ra, which means bad, right? So it's a play on words here, which is a lot of fun. So any year that we don't make those shofar blasts at the beginning, miri'in la bisofa, it's going to go poorly for us at the end of the year. And it's a very fun rabbinic play on words. My tama, what is the reason? Dila Arbav Satan, because we didn't take the time to, make sure that Hasatan was confused. So again, I don't know there's much to discuss there, but I think it's very fun to have an opportunity to see some of these great rabbinic plays on words. I see, hold on.
That's my dad.
Hand up, but it disappeared. Oh, great. Perfect. Doug.
Considering the importance of blowing the shofar as given by Gemara, how is it that the Shabbat prohibition comes into play in conservative and Orthodox services and the shofar is not blown for some reasons that seem to be very obscure and less important than the commandment in Torah and Gemara to do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because similarly, in a lot of congregations, Avinu Malkeinu is also not recited on Shabbat as well. And I think it's an interesting question. And I wonder if Rabbi Blake, if you have any thoughts on this, because I think you're right, there is a tension of values there between, what is considered acceptable to do on, and I will say, I guess one way to think about it is in the Jewish tradition, Shabbat is seen as, kind of taking precedence over most everything else. Even on the very holiest days of the year, the prohibitions of Shabbat take precedence over everything else.
And even if those prohibitions are to those of us who especially live outside of the Orthodox community and Orthodox practice, seem trivial or obscure.
Yes.
Like the idea of not, there are these rulings that suggest you're not allowed to carry items on Shabbat and you're not allowed to make tikkun or repair. And so musical instruments are outright forbidden on Shabbat, which is why in an Orthodox setting, you won't have musical instrumentation accompanying the singing on Shabbat service. And yeah, I think, Amanda, you've got it exactly right, that this is the big precept here is that Shabbat is paramount over all.
Yeah.
We had a thoughtful conversation lasting a total of about 3 sentences among the clergy team a few weeks ago, because Rosh Ha-Shanah does fall on a Shabbat this year, which means a few things, one of which is we had to make a decision about, do we do Avinu Malkeinu, do we blow shofar? That was a very easy yes. We're like, yeah, we know that it's not halachic, and we know that there are people in our congregation who, by the way, identify as coming from conservative or Orthodox backgrounds, significant numbers of people, but we're still going to blow shofar because we actually think that it ain't Rosh Hashanah unless we've really taken the opportunity to confuse the Satan.
Yeah.
Exactly. The other thing that comes about, though this is not so apt these days, but in the old Gates of Repentance prayer book, they would highlight the Sabbath passages in red Like because it's Shabbat on Friday night, you have to read Vishamru, which is not part of the Rosh Ha-Shanah liturgy, but it is part of the Shabbat liturgy. So a friend of ours, Roger Weisberg, refers to those selections, the ones written in red, as the Szechuan menu.
What is the prohibition against singing Avinu Malkeinu? Is that because it's supplicating God? It's requesting God to provide something, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbat? Is that the essence of it?
That's it. There you go. That's it exactly.
Yeah, it's petitionary prayer, whereas Shabbat is supposed to be only praise and thanks. It doesn't square very well with the whole idea of Rosh Hashanah, where supplication is kind of the name of the game. But so it is. So yeah, our community we will offer Avinu Malkeinu, we will blow shofar, and we probably won't even mention that we're doing it in violation of the Sabbath because it's part of our Reform custom. And I would say 98% of my Reform colleagues are going to have services that feature shofar and Avinu Malkeinu. Okay, so thank you, Cantor. You set us up beautifully to continue our exploration of one of the signature practices of Rosh Hashanah, which of course is sounding of the shofar. And now we're gonna skip ahead to Rosh Hashanah 26a, so 10 pages further in the Gemara, and actually starting with a passage of Mishnah. So I'll bring it up. If you're somehow following in another text, this may be numbered as paragraph 3. So Matani, which is, as we've said many times, you get this root with the Tav Nun. It's a Tanaitic or Mishnaic era teaching from one of the early sages, unnamed. It's just the kind of anonymous voice of the Mishnah speaking here. Kol ha-shofarot kasherim. That's a phrase that even those with a fairly, sparse Hebrew knowledge can translate. Kol shofarot, all shofars are kosher. Kol ha-shofarot kasherim. Any horn, any animal horn is kosher. And here they translate kosher as fit, but you can see the root is one that we all know, kasherim, kosher. Chutz, except mishel para, unless it came from a cow. Now, so what's the story here, right? Why would a cow horn be problematic? You can obviously hollow it out. You can sound it in the same way. Looks impressive, sounds impressive. Chutz mishel para mipnei shehu keren, because it is a horn where it goes by the name keren, velo shofar is the point. It's not actually a shofar. Now, why would a cow's horn not be a shofar? Why is it just a horn? Amar Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi, again, anytime you come across the name of a sage in Sefaria, if you hover your cursor over it, you get some dotted lines underneath. That's an invitation to click. And lo and behold, you can have a nice bio of the rabbi under discussion here. This is Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, 5th generation Tana, from the middle part of the 2nd century of the Common Era. It tells you how he was a student of Rabbi Akiva and so on and so forth. Just fun for you as a student of Talmud. Okay, v'halo kol hashofarot nikru keren. He's saying, but aren't all shofars called horns? So in the Venn diagram of what is a shofar, he's basically saying all shofars are horns, but not all horns are shofars, right? So keren, Rabbi Yossi is proposing, is a larger category of animal parts, but not every keren is in the smaller designation of a shofar. We're going to get into further into the weeds. Shne'emar, and here's your proof text. Shne'emar always sets up a proof text. B'meshoch bekeren hayovel. So it says, it shall come to pass that when they sound a long blast with the keren of a ram, from Joshua 5, and a ram's horn is a shofar, fit for sounding on Rosh Hashanah, question mark. Now that's all in the gloss, by the way. That's Steinsaltz. That's our editor's comment here. But so Rabbi Yossi is actually asking a question. Wait a minute. He's not actually saying that a shofar is a smaller designation. He's saying, aren't they the same thing? Isn't a shofar a horn and a horn is a shofar? Because we have this verse in Joshua where they're blasting the horns. They use the word keren, but it was clearly a shofar thing happening here. So goes on to say, here's the Gemara. I'm going to just pick up in the English. Rabbi Yossi is saying, well, in other words, he makes a good point. Why do the rabbis not accept it? Why is Rabbi Yossi's argument here not the one that prevails in rabbinic discourse? The Gemara explains that the rabbis counter Yossi's argument as follows. Indeed, all other shofarot are called shofar, and they are also called keren. So a shofar is a keren is a shofar, but that of a cow is called a keren and not a shofar. So there's still a problem with a cow horn. It is a horn, it can be sounded, but it's not a shofar. And they go into more of a proof text here from Deuteronomy, which is from this long poetic address that Moses gives to the Israelites at the end of his preaching career, just before he's about to go up the mountain and die. His firstborn bull, grandeur is his, and his horns, using the word keren, in this case in the possessive plural, karnav, are the horns of a karne, a wild ox. It is therefore clear that the horns of a bull are called keren, but not shofar. Okay, and on and on and on the text goes. Now, I want to ask you, why is a cow horn such a problem? Okay, we're going to get to the answer, but I'd like you to speculate for a minute. Steve.
My speculation is that it's a domesticated animal at that point and needs to be preserved in some way.
Great rabbinic reasoning, not the one the rabbis themselves came up with, because one could argue that at this time sheep and rams were also domesticated, right? So whether you're a cattle herder or a shepherd, you're still dealing with domesticated beasts. So that's not what the rabbis give us. Mom and Dad.
Does it go back to the Akedat where the ram's horn was quite specifically indicated?
You are closer. We're getting warmer. It does track to a biblical story, but it is a lesson to be inferred from the negative and not the positive. Let us see. I will show us the text and we'll see why the rabbis are arguing over whether or not a cow's horn can be a shofar. Okay. Picking up at section 7. Ula Amar, that's a real name. It's also the name of one of the Vikings of, or no, I think there's an Ula. No, that's an Uba. Okay. I'm a big Vikings fan. All right. Hainu Tama de Rabbanan. He said, this is the reasoning of the rabbis. Ki de Rav Chisda, according to the opinion of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said, for what reason does the high priest not enter the innermost sanctum with his golden garments to perform the service there on Yom Kippur? Everyone knows, I shouldn't say everyone knows, but the Yom Kippur, the signature ritual of Yom Kippur in the imagination of the rabbis, tracing back to biblical times, is that, and some of you may remember the old Gates of Repentance afternoon service of Yom Kippur. It was kind of this, we used to dramatize it with music and sometimes with visual slides from the drop-down screen at WRT. And there was a section in the middle that goes all the way back to the high priest on the morning of Yom Kippur. And it began with these words, the ritual begins at dawn. The high priest cloaked in his white robes, right? You remember this? It's one of those lines that just has become kind of like a verbal meme in the office. Those of us who toil in the vineyard of preparing the high holiday services, sometimes we'll be sitting around my table in my office and Cantor will say, what time are we starting Yom Kippur services this year? And I will say, the ritual begins at dawn. The high priest cloaked in his robes. And it's like, it presents this whole, like, again, it's dramaturgy. It's not just reading a story. It's inviting us to be the actors in the story. And it was beautifully written. Larry Hoffman, our wonderful teacher, one of the great living thinkers of our movement or any movement, it was actually had a significant hand in writing that liturgy for the afternoon of Yom Kippur. You miss it, I miss it, but it's not in the machzor that we have now. In any case, that story is the heart of how the rabbis imagined Yom Kippur in biblical times. The high priest would go into the Kodesh HaKodashim, the innermost sanctum of the ancient temple, shrouded in incense, and would do one thing. The priest would pronounce the 72-letter name of God that no one else could pronounce, and only once a year. And that would be the way of invoking divine favor on the day of judgment. Okay, that's the myth that we're recounting on Yom Kippur. But the rabbis are pointing out something interesting. They're talking about the priest's clothing, and they're saying, Davka on that day, on that one day necessarily, the priest was not dressed in his usual work clothes, which included gold, bells made out of gold along the hem of the priest's garment, so that you could always hear him. So what's the problem with bringing gold into the innermost sanctum of the temple? And what does that have to do with cows? Well, gold and cows don't go together so well in Jewish memory.
Yeah. The golden calf.
That's right. It is because a prosecutor cannot become an advocate. All right. In other words, you can't flip sides. When you're standing in judgment in the court of God. Here's how Steinsaltz puts it. Since the Jewish people committed the sin of worshiping the golden calf, the high priest may not enter the Holy of Holies to atone for the Jewish people wearing golden garments, as they would bring that sin to mind. So what's the issue with blowing a cow's horn? It would evoke the sin of the golden calf. So now you can bring lots of different animal horns to temple to sound a shofar, but not a horn made from a bull, because it is considered not kosher. And this becomes the definitive reasoning even today. You don't make a shofar out of a bull's horn. Michelle Braun.
What does a vegan Jew blow?
Yeah, you can carve a shofar out of a beet. No, I really don't know. Like, some people do that because, you have the same issue with how do you do a vegan Seder? So much of the Seder ritual is about the Pesach offering, and you have to have an animal bone and it has to be roasted. But in thoughtful consideration of the fact that, many Jewish minds far more brilliant than mine have argued that the Torah actually promotes a strong vegan ethic. Or at least a vegetarian ethic. If you look at the way God designs the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are not eating other animals. They're eating only plants. Only after the destruction of the flood and Noah lands on Mount Ararat do they start sacrificing animals for meat. So one could argue that, that there's a way to do a vegan horn sounding, but if there is, I do not know of it. And I do not know of anyone who has objected to the sounding of a shofar on animal rights grounds, though it is probably somebody has written about this. Michelle, you're a Jewish educator, so you have some homework to do. Okay. Cantor, shall we pick up? Yeah, Ruth, please.
It's interesting to me that the golden calf makes the bull's horn not kosher, and yet that doesn't extend to kosher in terms of eating beef, the golden calf.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. I'm glad.
I guess it's different if you eat it
yeah.
than if you worship it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Eating something specifically means that it is not consecrated. But yeah, anyway, we're having a little bit of fun. And you can see, I've said this many times before, but I'll say it again. Although much academic literature about rabbinic writing would have you believe that there are two genres of rabbinic literature. There's Agadah, which is folklore, and Halacha, which is law. For the rabbis, it's all interwoven, right? You can read a passage that is fundamentally halachic, it's about Jewish law and practice, and get a lot of folklore, or you can be reading a passage that is primarily folkloric in tone and style, but you'll derive legal principles from it. And that's what's happening here. I could not really definitively answer that this text is one or the other. It's both. It's a legal text that tells you you cannot blow a shofar made out of a bull's horn because it's not a shofar, it's just a horn. That's a halachic principle, but the story behind it is very much agadic, right? It is folkloric, that we're going back to the story of the golden calf, and we don't want to evoke the Jewish people's sin of the golden calf at the very moment that we're asking God to forgive us and pardon us and grant us atonement. Okay. Cantor, I think you're up.
Great. This is a perfect segue from what we just read, and specifically from Ruth's question, which is a study in contradictions for us, because the text that we're about to look at is about to tell us why it's okay to have fulfilled your commandment to sound the shofar in using a shofar that was used for idol worship. Right?
I have several of those in my office, by the way. I got my shofars on eBay, and of dubious provenance. They might have been used for worshiping Baal or Vishnu. I'm sorry, it's just they were cheap.
But we literally just talked about not using a bull's horn because it might remind us of the golden calf, and we're about to talk about why you can have fulfilled your mitzvah in using a shofar that had been used for avodah zarah and for idol worship. So I think that this is a very interesting segue and a very interesting reminder to us of how much fun it is to dig deep into all of the contradictions that we find within our rabbinic literature.
And I would add here that when Amanda and I were preparing today's conversation, we talked about what are the big themes here? And that's a great question to put back to you. Like, I think that I'll ask you the question, and then maybe over the course of our remaining 35 minutes or so, you can begin to tease out a general precept or two that the rabbis are trying to communicate. I believe they are fairly consistent about the answer. The question is, what does it mean to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar? What exactly about this ritual fulfills the mitzvah? Is it hearing the shofar? Does it have to do with the sound it makes? Does it have to do with the intention of the one who's blowing it? Does it have to do with the intention of the one who's hearing it? I mean, what really matters in this ritual, I think, is what we're asking. And I do think the rabbis are fairly consistent in their answers, but Cantor, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So we're going to focus now on this question that Rabbi Blake just asked around what is the intention. And Rabbi Blake is going to focus on what is the intention that the person who is sounding the shofar or hearing the shofar has, and what kind of intention or kavanah is needed in order to fulfill the obligation of sounding the shofar. And I'm going to focus on another perspective on that same question, which is specifically what was the purpose of the object that we're using to sound the shofar, and how important is the intention around the use of the object in fulfilling the mitzvah and fulfilling the obligation. So this is a short, but I think very interesting passage that we are going to look at together. And it speaks to the question of whether
you can click the X next to resources on the right-hand side, and it will enlarge down a little bit right there.
Yeah.
And then you can enlarge the text from there.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's my usual. It takes a little bit of like wiggling. Yeah. Thanks.
Keep
Ken.
reminding me, please, because I
No. It's all good. It's all good.
2 to 3 times I do it. Thank you. And so what we're looking at here is the question of a shofar that has been used in idol worship, and whether we can fulfill the mitzvah of sounding the shofar with a shofar that has been used in some way in the practice of idol worship. And we read Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says, "B'shofar shel avodah zara lo yitaka." A shofar that has been used for the purpose of idol worship, you should not sound it. V'im taka, if you do sound it, yatsa. Yatsa is the rabbinic word that means you fulfilled your obligation. So don't do it, but if you did it, you fulfilled your obligation. What is I think important to keep in mind here, and is just something that's interesting for any student of Talmud, is that there's a principle that's that sets against each other two ideas. There's an idea called lichatchila, and there's an idea that's called b'diavad. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced b'di'eved. Lichatchila is the question of whether it's okay to do something from the start. Like, is it okay to take a shofar and to say, I know this shofar has been used for purposes of idol worship, and to sound it? That's lichatchila. No, that's not okay. B'diavad means after the fact. So if after the fact If you've already sounded the shofar, and then you were to find out that this shofar had been used for purposes of idol worship, do you need to go back and find another shofar and start over again? And the answer is no. So you shouldn't, like, they're basically saying, like, you shouldn't do it, but if you already did it, that's okay. So what we're learning here is that perhaps there is a way to repurpose objects for holiness in some way, or for a Jewish purpose. But then it gives us a second scenario, bishofar shel ir hanidachat, a shofar that was used in an idolatrous city. And we're going to come back to this in a second. And if it's okay with Rabbi Blake, take like a really slight tangent, because the idea of the idolatrous city is one that appears many times throughout the Talmud and throughout rabbinic literature. And just as a student of Talmud, it's I think helpful and good to know what that's talking about and what the idolatrous city is. But so when we're talking about the case of a shofar that belonged to somebody who lived in an idolatrous city, that in that case, you cannot sound that shofar. And if you have already done it, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So in that case, this particular shofar is not okay lechatchila. It's not okay to find that shofar and sound it, and it is not okay b'diavad. It's not okay after the fact either. If you sounded that shofar and then found out that it came from an idolatrous city, you need to go back and find a new shofar and start over again. And then we read mai tama. What is the reason here? Ir hanidachat katote mechatat shiure. I had to read slowly to get my Aramaic words all pronounced correctly there. And so mai tama, which means like what is the reason that you cannot sound a shofar that came from an idolatrous city? Because everything in an idolatrous city, and I'm scroll down here just so you can see the translation, everything that's in an idolatrous city is commanded to be burned or crushed, as it's translated here. So in this case, we're seeing our shofar from the idolatrous city as having already been burned or crushed and therefore unfit for use. I'd love to go back just for a moment to very briefly talk about what this ir hanidachat, this idolatrous city is, because it's not talking about in a general sense. If there's a city where the people are just idolatrous people or not good people, it's talking about sort of a very specific situation that's a reference to a biblical text from the book of Deuteronomy. I'm going to actually open this in a different window because it's not a reference that's given here. So we're looking at Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 13. And I'm going to read this just in English. If you hear it said of one of the towns that Adonai your God is giving you to dwell in, that some scoundrels from among you have gone and subverted the inhabitants of their town, saying, "Come, let us worship other gods whom you have not experienced," you shall investigate and inquire and interrogate thoroughly. If it is true, the fact is established, that abhorrent thing was perpetuated in your midst. Then you put the inhabitants of that town to the sword, and put its cattle to the sword, doom it and all that is in it to destruction. Gather all its spoil into the open square, and burn the town and all its spoil as a holocaust to Adonai your God, and it shall remain an everlasting ruin, never to be rebuilt. So I'm going back to our Talmud text here, but we're saying, basically what we're talking about is this very specific situation of an idolatrous city where the majority of the people in the city are idol worshipers, are people who are not fulfilling God's commandments, and that city is judged. All of the people who are idol worshipers are killed, and everything in the city is destroyed. And the rabbis in general are very uncomfortable with this concept. It's among a number of concepts in the Talmud, like, for instance, the stubborn and rebellious child, the stubborn and rebellious son, who in the Talmud is killed for his transgressions, and the rabbis are not comfortable with that either. But this is among a number of concepts that many of the rabbis say never actually existed and never will exist. It's meant to serve as sort of an example of a level of extreme that probably, didn't really happen, and the rabbis didn't think really ever would happen. But if you were to have that case or that situation, you can't use that shofar. So this is actually an interesting conversation about whether we can repurpose objects or repurpose spaces that have been used for either non-Jewish or non-sacred purposes as Jewish objects or Jewish spaces. Alan.
This brings to my mind, the lesson that Shabbat and Yontif candles should be prepared with the intention to be used as Shabbat and Yontif candles. We're not to use decorative Christmas candles for Jewish ritual. We're not to use birthday candles for Jewish ritual. And this, I think, is in the same vein.
And similarly, we're not to use Hanukkah candles to sit and read a book, right? We're to use Hanukkah candles purely for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah candles. I'll give, and Rabbi Blake is actually going to talk more specifically around this idea of the intention of the people who are fulfilling the obligation. Another, I think, interesting rabbinic debate that's similar to this one is the question of whether a space that was used as a house of worship for another religion can be repurposed as a synagogue. And there's a real rabbinic debate around that. But there are a number of rabbinic sources who rule in the same way as the Talmud does, which is lechatchila, like, no, you can't go purchase a space that has been used as a house of worship for another faith and then turn it into a synagogue. But if you have your synagogue and you're praying in your synagogue and you learned that it used to be a house of worship of another faith, you don't have to sell the building and move your synagogue out of there. But it's a really interesting question about what it means for us to repurpose something that was used not for holiness at all, or for holiness as defined by another person or group of people, and to make that object a holy one for us. Steve.
I think you raise a very interesting concept about what do we mean by repurpose. And I think another broad interpretation can be that the reason we should be more open and flexible to accepting repurpose and even support it is that Torah, the wisdom of Torah recognizes our lives are not always perfect. We are not always achieving spirituality. We're going to have flaws. And yet God and Torah acknowledge that even by selecting Jacob as one of our patriots, we're going to be struggling all along. So you could argue that when you want to look at a space or an object, if it was used for one purpose, but now a group of Jews with intentionality and purpose want to use it as part of their expression of spirituality, we should encourage that, because it's really the whole part of recognizing daily life. We are going to slip and fall. It's not one linear path towards spirituality.
Thank you.
I think that's I love that interpretation, because what you can see is that sort of despite the halacha around these issues, the rabbis tend to lean in the direction that you're talking about. So the halacha is that a mitzvah cannot come about through a transgression. The fulfillment of a commandment can't come about through a transgression. But then you see later on, you might think, like, a perfect example of this is you can't steal someone else's shofar and then fulfill your obligation through that. But actually you can, because what the rabbis decide about that is that you could have theoretically possibly come into possession of the shofar in another way, and just the fact that you're holding it doesn't mean that you stole it, or doesn't mean, and so even though we have this concept that we can't fulfill an obligation that comes from a transgression. I think the rabbis do, like you said, Steve, want to find ways for us to be recognizing that we're human, and that we can shift and change and move in the direction of righteousness and holiness.
But I would also say, thank you for that, that this is an example where at times I like to be bound by Torah and not by rabbinical Judaism. They're different. And why not go to the fundamental themes of Torah in terms of recognizing, as we both said, we're going to slip and slide and make mistakes and be fallible. But if we keep picking ourselves up like Jacob, that's what we're being urged to do. And we could respect the rabbinic Judaism discussions, but we look to Torah for your fundamental guidance.
Well, thank you. Thank you. All right, Rabbi Blake, I think
Right.
we're back to you here.
Right. So we're really talking about like what makes for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of shofar. And we've just seen how the item itself matters. It may not be the only thing that matters, but some shofarot, some shofars are not kosher. Either they came from the wrong animal, namely a bull, not a kosher. It is a kosher animal, but it's not a kosher shofar because it evokes the sin of the golden calf. And then we've even talked about, well, shofarot that are either acquired under dubious circumstances or directly link the shofar, the object, the physical thing itself, to the practice of idolatry, or from a place where idolatry was practiced, all of which changes the status of the shofar and calls into question whether or not a person has fulfilled the mitzvah. And as you've seen, there are certain stringencies that are mentioned in the text, but there are also certain leniencies that are permitted in the text. That if you've already done it, most of the time the rabbis are willing to say, okay, well, you still fulfilled the mitzvah because you weren't knowingly violating any precept. But if you know that your shofar is an ill-gotten shofar, either received by way of theft or used in the commission of idolatry, you can't blow that shofar knowing what you now know about it. The question of intentionality behind the deed, not just behind the thing, but behind the deed, is what is referenced in this next Gemara. So as you can see, it picks up kind of in the middle of an idea that we'll have to go backward in order to move forward. Rav Ashi said, we're dealing with a case where the Persians compelled him to eat. What? And then all of us, so what are we talking about? So if I zip back up one sugya. All right, it is related that the following ruling was sent from Eretz Yisrael to Shmuel's father. If one was forcibly compelled to eat matzah on Passover, he has fulfilled his obligation. Okay, I shudder to think of this scenario being played out in real life, where a person was force-fed matzah. I mean, matzah is bad enough just choosing to eat it, but somebody forcing it down your gullet is just really unappetizing and kind of scary. But there's this idea that, okay, if a person is not choosing to eat matzah, but somebody forces him to eat matzah, has he fulfilled the mitzvah of achilat matzah? And you'll recall that there are many Baruch Atah Adonai moments in the Passover Seder, but one of the few places where we say Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, that we thank God for giving us a specific mitzvah that is fulfilled. In the following way, we complete the prayer with Al Achilat Matzah. It's the only food besides maror that is a commanded food to eat on Pesach. You have to say Al Achilat Matzah. Thank you, God, for the mitzvah of eating the matzah. Al Achilat Maror. Thank you for the mitzvah of eating the maror. These are, you have to eat them, right? And then you put them together, a Hillel sandwich, all of that good stuff. You have to do them, they're mitzvot. But is it a mitzvah? Are you fulfilling a mitzvah if you're not choosing to do it? This is a really interesting big question. Any mitzvah. So the analogy that's going to be brought is force feeding matzah, but we're going to get to shofar. Okay, well, the Gemara clarifies no matter who compelled him to eat the matzah. Well, maybe there are different categories of force feeding matzah. If we say that a demon forced him, in other words, he was eating the matzah against his own will, but it wasn't another person shoving it down his throat. He was seized by insanity, is what they say. He ate it in a moment of insanity. Well, this is a difficulty, because is he choosing it, or is it being chosen for him? Isn't it taught in a Baraita, an extra Mishnaic but contemporaneous text, with regard to someone who is at times sane and at times insane? At the times when he is sane, he is considered halachically competent for all purposes and is obligated in all the mitzvot. But when he's insane, he's considered insane for all purposes. In other words, if you have a person who variously demonstrates mental competency and mental incompetency, you have to know which state of mind is in effect at the time that a person does a certain mitzvah. Okay, moving on. Rav Ashi said, no, we're not talking about demonic possession or insanity. We're talking about a case where foreigners, idolaters, Persians, forced a person to eat matzah. Okay, now the analogy. Rava said, that is to say, one who sounds a shofar for the music, having no intent to fulfill the mitzvah, still fulfills the obligation, since the critical issue is hearing the blast and not the intent of the blower. I want to read that again, because then it goes back to matzah. One who sounds a shofar just because they like the sound. And I have a nice shofar, some of you have seen. It's not mine, it's a loaner from WRT, but it lives in my office on kind of permanent loan. And I was a trumpeter as a kid. I practiced trumpet from 4th grade through 12th grade. I took it with me to college, played sparingly, but discovered that I much more enjoyed making music in choral settings, collegiate a cappella and choir and whatnot. Didn't pick up the trumpet again very much after that. Still have the trumpet downstairs. It was a bar mitzvah gift from my grandparents of blessed memory on my mom's side, so I'm reluctant to part with it, even though I haven't really played it in years. The shofar that I have, as it turns out, is a very musical shofar. And I can produce 4 distinctive pitches at melodious intervals when I play that shofar. So I can play bugle calls on the shofar. You can play reveille, you can play taps, you can play call to colors, all of the customary bugle calls. A bugle is a horn without valves. So you make the different pitches just by changing your embouchure and the flow of air. You can do that with my shofar. So theoretically, I could sit in my office and play, La Bamba on my shofar. I've never done that, but I could. And the question is, if I play the shofar just for the music, or even if I'm kind of like composing like a new arrangement of tekiyas and teruas and blasting the shofar in its conventional sound patterns, has one who has heard that sound fulfilled the mitzvah, which is not, by the way, the mitzvah on Rosh Ha-Shanah is not to blow a shofar. It is not incumbent on all of the Israelites or all the Jewish people to know how to blow a shofar. When we get to the shofar service in 3 weeks from tomorrow, yikes, or 3 weeks from Saturday, when we're blowing shofar on Saturday, the 16th of September, Cantor is going to chant a blessing beforehand. And does anyone know what the blessing is for the shofar service? Baruch atah has this fanfare-like cadence. Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lishmoa kol shofar. Now I want to break down the last part of it. You know the first 10 words up to v'tzivanu. Lishmoa, to listen to, kol shofar, the voice of the shofar. So what's the mitzvah of shofar?
To listen.
To listen. So what the rabbis are challenging here is the notion that anything matters other than the intention of the one who is hearing. It's not about the intention of the one who is blowing, right? The one who's blowing could be playing the shofar in order to make pretty music, but anyone in the congregation who hears the shofar has fulfilled the mitzvah because their intention is to receive the sound of the shofar as a call to prayer or repentance, or in evocation of the binding of Isaac, or all the many different things that we have seen today are kind of the built up associations that the rabbis provide for the sounding of the shofar. Susan Esther. Let me unmute. Oh, you have to unmute yourself. My
Yeah.
friend. Thank you.
I remember last week you said that there were 3 purposes for blowing the shofar, and one of them was to rest and to bring the congregation together. And what I wanted to just piggyback on what Steve said, I thought that was a beautiful thing. I hope I'm pronouncing the correct congregant. That updating it, and you mentioned that the blasts are said differently for the Orthodox and the conservative, and that we update it. But the purpose of the blast is not only to bring people together, but when you say it, when you do the blast more than once, it's the intention of making sure people understand, people have heard, and people come together. You know, when you say something once, well, maybe they didn't hear, but the repetition of it, you meant it, Rabbi. So that's what I'm getting out of everything you've said so far.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would say, you know, not so much rest, but definitely convoking or gathering the people. Shofarot were sounded for the purpose of public assembly. They were actually sounded as military calls to bring the people to war, but they were also associated with times of coronation. You know, and this is still true. How many of you watched any of the coronation of King Charles? There were lots of horns being sounded that day. And the sounding of horns is biblical around the time of coronations. And of course, one of the great themes that the rabbis bring to our understanding of Rosh Ha-Shanah is that it is a coronation ceremony. We are crowning God king again. It's not that God ever stopped being king. It's that we stopped following the king, sovereign, right? Over the past year, we have fallen away. We forgot that the king's rules are the rules. We're like, who needs Shabbos? Who needs all of this Jewish stuff? Who needs ethics? I'm going to do it my way. And then the sound of the shofar is like, guess who's still king? And we're going to have a big crowning God king ceremony, which is why, by the way, when you open your machzor, one of the first words that your eyes will spot is a very, very large, I believe it's on page 18, Cantor would know this, on the Rosh Ha-Shanah machzor. It says, Hamelech. Like big print. It's really the beginning of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy is Hamelech, which is the king. It's like, all hail the king. And then by the end of the Rosh Hashanah ceremony, we'll be sounding shofarot. And all of these things are appropriate intentions that the listener may, or associations that the listener may bring to the enterprise of hearing shofar. So on the one hand, there's the intention of the instrument or the intention behind the instrument itself. On the other hand, there's the intention of the one who is engaged in the act of prayer and listening. And then we'll have time for probably one more set of texts that I'm going to hand off to Cantor, but I'm going to take Steve's question first.
So it gets to your last comment about the mitzvot focusing on the intention of the listener, meaning it's not just a physical act of hearing it, but when you've chosen to come to services, including hearing the shofar, you're also bringing your intentionality to let the shofar blast impact you, to jolt you into, again, trying to have intentionality and intensity in terms of your prayer at this moment.
Thank you so much. Right. I mean, look, on the one hand, prayer is a very personal experience. On the other hand, in Judaism, prayer is also a shared communal experience. But the rabbis, I would say, fairly consistently advise that merely showing up for services and going through the motions isn't really prayer, right? At the end of the day, you need to bring what we call kavanah. There are 2 elements of Jewish praying. One is the keva, which is the fixed part. It's the words on the page, or it's the ritual of sounding the shofar using a kosher shofar that wasn't repurposed from an idolatrous setting, and all of the other regulations. All of that is the keva. You got to do the thing in the right way. Judaism is not a tradition, at least traditionally, that is particularly loosey-goosey about how it is observed. But that's not enough. Right. I think, Steve, you're exactly right. It's like, well, what do you, as the one who is engaged in the act of prayer, repentance, and standing before God in judgment, what are you thinking about in that moment? What are you feeling? How are you bringing your full self to the enterprise of Jewish prayer? Okay, Cantor, you can choose your favorite of the remaining texts to conclude our learning. I know there are too many for us to cover today, but that's why the whole class has access to the syllabus. And with all the time in the world that everyone has, you can spend all of your week going back to the sugyot that we didn't get to today.
My last text is a little bit long, so so if you have one that's a little bit shorter, it would probably make more sense to conclude with that.
Brilliant. I do, as a matter of fact. So thank you for the, see, we get along so well. Okay, so the last text I want to look at is Rosh Ha-Shanah 34b, section 7. Okay, and this really summarizes, I think, the rabbinic view of everything we've been talking about. But do, if you like this and you have the time, these are fairly approachable texts, and of course, Sefaria really is designed not only for pros, but for the Jews in the pews as well, to go on your own time and learn more, and you can use the syllabus to guide you. This is the text, though, that I brought to conclude today's lesson. We're back in we've moved almost to the very end of the tractate, by the way. Rosh Ha-Shanah, as I said last week, is a fairly short tractate. Yoma, the one we're going to be spending more time with starting next week. Next week we transition. We're going to do a little bit more from tractate Rosh Ha-Shanah. We're going to get into tractate Yoma, which is the tractate in the Talmud about Yom Kippur. Yoma is a much longer tractate. So a lot more to say about Yom Kippur than Rosh Hashanah, both in the Bible and in the Talmud. But here, as we're getting toward the end of the tractate, we start getting some of the big themes. And this is conventional for the way the Talmud unfolds. You know, there's so many weeds that you have to get through in the halachic discourse, but by the time you get to the end of a tractate, the rabbis often pull back the curtain to reveal the bigger themes that they want you to pay attention to all along. This is one such example. The Gemara asks, "My Tama, what's the reason?" And because the Talmud speaks in this very kind of terse and elliptical way, you may be guessing, if you just pick this text out cold like we did, not in sequence from what immediately came before. Well, what's the reason for what? The antecedent is, of course, everything we've been talking about for the last 20 pages or so of Talmud. All of this blasting and blessing and doing the thing around the shofar. What's the point of it? Why? What's the big, we know the what now. We know what you can do, we know what you can't do, kind of. Because the rabbis don't tend to give definitive laws in the Talmud so much as they present us with the whole discourse. We have a basic sense of what shofar is all about, what horns are acceptable, which are not, what attitude or posture as a prayerful person one has to bring to the enterprise of hearing shofar. All of that has been covered. But why? What's the point? Amar Rabbah said that the Holy One, blessed be God, said, all right, in other words, we're going back to something God told us as the rabbis imagine it. So we have a direct edict from the king here. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God said, Imru lefanai beRosh Hashanah, you should recite in my presence on Rosh Hashanah 3 categories of stuff. Malchuyot, or here it's written Malchiyot, which means things pertaining to kingship. Remember what I just said, that Rosh Hashanah is coronation day in the Jewish tradition. And by the way, fun fact, many people believe that Aleinu, the prayer that is always penultimate in a Jewish worship service, right before the recitation of the Mourner's Kaddish, we stand, in many communities, we open the ark, we bow. Aleinu, that prayer that says, it is now on us to praise the God who created everything. V'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim u'modim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim. That's the signature line. That's v'anachnu korim, which means, and we bend our knees, u'mishtachavim u'modim, and we bow and we give thanks. Lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, before the King of Kings. That's what we're saying. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of Blessing. Most scholars believe that Aleinu L'Shabeach, that prayer, was originally part of the ancient Rosh Hashanah service. It is maybe the oldest part of biblical Rosh Hashanah that is still preserved in the rabbinic literature and in our daily prayers. It was originally, it's coronation day. We bow before the king. Okay, so God says you have to remind the people of my kingship, zichronot, the remembrances, such as the remembrance of the binding of Isaac, or the remembrance of all the ways in which God delivered the people in times gone by, vishofarot, and all the verses pertaining to the blasting of shofar. So these three elements have to be recited on Rosh Hashanah. Malchuyot, Kadeshe Tamlichuni Aleichem, in order that you will install me as your king. What does it say? So that you will crown me as a king over you. It's coronation day again. Zichronot, the remembrances, so that your remembrance will rise before me for good. In other words, it's not just what we remember, it's a plea. God, please remember us. We are frail, we are flawed, we are like clouds floating by, a particle of dust on the wind. Unatana Tokef, the medieval piyut, many centuries past this literature that we're studying here, says it all. We are but dust and ashes. But God, remember us anyway. Remember our good deeds. Put it in that book so that we can live to praise you some more in the new year. And finally, so it says, Zichrono Kadeshi Yavo Lefanai Zichronechem Letova, so that you'll remember us for good. And finally, Uvameh, and how do we do all this? Bishofar. Uvameh, Bishofar. Two very powerful words. How do we invoke all of these things at once? How do we create a prayer experience that simultaneously evokes God's sovereignty or kingship, the desire to be remembered in God's sight for good, and all of the ways in which one particular sound in Jewish consciousness, in Jewish memory, is associated with not just this time of year, but all the things that we bring before the altar, as it were, on the new year? One sound, and that's with the shofar. It's a summary of everything that has come before it in the previous 18 pages of Talmud. How do we get God to do all of this, and how do we orient ourselves to be in that prayerful position where our kavanah, our intention, is to crown God king again, to be remembered for good, and to recall all the other times in Jewish past where a shofar was sounded as a sign of deliverance? One sound. And that's the sound of the shofar. So that really kind of encapsulates everything we've been learning today, and why that one sound is so important, and probably also informs why we at WRT have decided, despite the traditional restriction on blowing shofar on the Sabbath, we're going to do it anyway. I'm happy to take last questions or comments before we conclude, and some of you we hope to see at the Caring Community Luncheon at the Temple in just a few moments.
Whoa.
Steve.
I want to thank you and Cantor, Kleinman, for your decision, as you said, to both blow the shofar and recite Avinu Malkeinu, since if the ultimate goal from Torah, as opposed to rabbinical Judaism, is to enable all of us to be jolted into real intense prayer, that to me is the ultimate mitzvah you're enabling us all to do.
Thank you. And I promise you, I will do my homework and make sure that my shofar did not come from an idolatrous city. Dad?
I want to share a little comment that I believe Larry Hoffman made, maybe going all the way back to Synagogue 2000, about Aleinu, in which in a capsule phrase he said, it really is a way of saying, this is all up to you.
Mm-hmm. That's right. The covenant takes two. God is king, but what good is a king without subjects? Willing subjects. Subjects who are not just going through the motions. And on that note, we want to wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. Just speaking personally, it's really delightful, Amanda, Cantor, Kleinman, as always, to learn with you and from you. And I hope that our community of learners now has yet another word of praise to say about their Cantor, that what an incredible scholar and illuminating teacher you are. Really, this is going to be fun. We have 2 more sessions together with each other and with all of you. Next week, same bat time, same bat channel, we're going to be taking up the questions of Tshuva. So we talked a lot about like the signature sound of the season, the shofar, and what it means and why we do it, and what we can do and what we can't do. And we even learned a little bit about Satan today. Next week, we're going to get it deep into the inner work of the high holidays. Like, okay, Now that we're all called to order, now that we know that we have to like reinstall God as the sovereign, now what? And Teshuvah also creates a spiritual bridge from Rosh Hashanah to the Day of Atonement. And then our final session will really be about Yom Kippur exclusively. And the hope is that by the time the 1st of Tishrei, the new year, rolls around, those of us who've been learning this material will come to our worship on the high holidays with a much deeper vocabulary and set of awarenesses around what these holidays are all about. So with that, bid you well. And an early Lashana Tova, you can say that all month.
Kol hakavod to you both.
Yasher
Thanks, everyone. Take care.